So welcome to all the participants and attendees to this one of the first ordinary session that are taken now in parallel, whose theme is Employment, Income Inequality, and Political Economy of Economic Policy. As you will have seen at the program that you have received, will have noted that we have three papers. We have a paper written by José Ferreiro, me, and two colleagues about employment protection and its impact on the dynamics of employment and employment in Europe. We have another second paper written by José Oreiro from the University of Brasilia about probably with some other colleagues, I think. Whose title is Measuring the Technological Backwardness of Middle and Low-Income Countries, the Employment Quality Gap and its relations with the per capita income gap. And we have another paper made by Pedro Micussi, whose title is The Political Economy of Economic Policy, Industrial Entrepreneurs and Macroeconomic Crisis in Brazil, 2003-2016. The plan is that we present the three papers in a row, giving approximately 20-25 minutes for present each paper. And at the end of the session, that will allow us to have around 20-25 minutes for questions that can come from the presenters and also from the people that are attending online the session. For all these people, as you see, you know, there is a chat at the YouTube channel where you can write your questions to any of the three papers, any of the three presenters. So we will receive we will read these questions, and we will move these questions to the related speakers. So, in this sense, again, I want to thank you for starting this session formally. I want to thank you to the organizers of the members and the chair of the Structural Development Research Group, José Oreiro, and all his colleagues to organize the workshop, and again to all the people that are attending the different sessions that form this workshop. So, and now we will start. There is no problem, no objection. We can start the session presenting the first paper. In this case, it will be will follow the scheduled program, and try to open. I will try to open my slides. There it is. And I will try to present my research that is, as you can see, the paper is titled Employment Protection, its Impact on the Dynamics of Employment and Unemployment in Europe. That it's a paper elaborated in collaboration with one colleague of my department, Carmen Gomez, who is also a member of the Structural Development Research Group, and with Professor Philip Arestis from the University of Cambridge. So, what is to start with the user procedure, we will present what is the main objective of the paper. In this sense, the objective of our paper, our research, is to analyze whether employment protection legislation, it's called EPL, that is the legal conditions that regulate the hiring of workers and the dismissal or termination, is an explanatory variable for the employment and unemployment outcomes in European countries. Specifically, if it's a variable that explains the growth of total employment, employees, and unemployment rates. In this sense, the results obtained in our analysis, we hope that allow us to test the validity of the new Keynesian hypothesis. That is the interaction that, according to this approach, it is the interaction between economic growth and labor institutions, in this case specifically the employment protection legislation, what determines the labor market outcomes and therefore the evolution of employment and unemployment rates. In this sense, as you will know, the hypothesis of this approach is that the higher the employment protection legislation, that, in other words, a larger rigidity in the labor markets will generate a negative impact on labor market outcomes. That's therefore it will slow down the growth of unemployment and will cause also a rise in unemployment rates. So in this sense, following this the approach, the economic policy implication is obvious. Labor market must be reformed, and removing all the rigidities of the labor market, and in this sense, it is strongly recommended to reduce the employment protection for permanent and temporary workers, mainly into adopting two main measures. On the one hand, is facilitating the use of atypical contracts, employment contracts, for instance, facilitating the use of temporary workers, and also reducing high firing costs. And besides testing the validity of this approach, in our opinion, this is a relevant question because it also allows to test whether the reforms that have made, especially in Europe, the labor markets more flexible in the last 2 decades, that has been taking place via the reduction of firing costs and facilitating the use of temporary contracts, have had a positive impact on labor markets. That is, it has contributed to accelerate job creation and the decline in unemployment rates. In other words, we are trying to evaluate where if this kind of reform has had a positive impact on the economic activity and the labor markets in these countries. As I have mentioned before, the background, the theoretical background of this analysis lead us to the new Keynesian economies that argues that the high employment rate protection, that is a rigid labor market, leads to poor employment and unemployment outcomes. And thus, according to the empirical jobs that have followed this approach, this would be one of the main reasons behind, for instance, the high employment, unemployment rates that many European countries have registered, especially since the decade of the 80s. In this case, in the last decades, we began, for instance, in Spain in the decade of the 80s, but there was a strong movement of reforms in the decades of the 90s and also in the first decade of this century. Many countries, not only developed, but also, and following the example of developed and European countries, many developing countries have made their labor market more flexible, approving reforms that have reduced their firing costs and that have favored the use of atypical contracts, mainly temporary employment contracts, to stimulate the job creation and to reduce the high employment rates existing. The problem is that despite these widespread reforms, the empirical evidence is not conclusive, and thus there is a recent growing body of work that concludes that the employment protection does not affect employment or unemployment, and that, on the contrary, the excessive labor flexibility caused by these reforms has had negative micro and macroeconomic effects. So, in this sense, as I have mentioned, there is a large literature and theoretical and empirical literature on this topic. But we believe that in our papers makes a strong contribution to the existing literature for a number of reasons. Some of them that are summarized in the slide. Thus, for instance, contrary and in opposition to other studies that focus only on, for instance, the evolution of employment, or the employees' salary employment or unemployment rates, and that analyze this the impact of employment protection legislation of any of these themes. We are analyzing the impact at the same paper of employment protection legislation on these three variables. Moreover, and this is a relevant contribution, most of the papers are using data that are based only, on the one hand, on labor force statistics, or they are using data for employment, specifically based on national accounts data. We are using both of these data because data are quite similar. There's a high correlation between this data, but they are slightly different. So we are using the two sources of data in order to test the robustness of the results, because we understood that, for instance, if we that in the impact of the employment protection legislation should be the same, regardless if we are using data from labor force statistics or we are using national accounts data. If, on the contrary, we find different results in terms, for instance, of the significance of this variable, or the size of the coefficient, or even, for instance, the sign of the coefficient corresponding to the employment protection legislation, it would mean that the results are not robust, because they can differ depending on the variable that you are using to obtain the data of our explained variable. Moreover, we are also using not only we are using two variables that are related to economic growth, GDP growth, and also gross fixed capital formation growth rates. In this way, we are using this because there is a discrepancy, for instance, between orthodox studies that use the variable GDP growth, and the post-Keynesian and other heterodox analysis who argue that it's not the GDP, the economic activity in general, but the process of productive accumulation, productive capital accumulation, who determines the evolution of the variable related to the employment of employee. Again, it should be expected that the results should be the same, regardless what variable are using. So we are using these two variables not only to test the validity of the post-Keynesian or the orthodox approaches, but also to test the robustness of the result that we have obtained. And we are also testing not only a linear relationship between dependent variables and employment protection, but also the existence of a nonlinear relationship, as well as the existence of interaction effects between employment protection legislation and economic growth. And this is important because in most, if not all, the empirical studies are analyzing a linear relation between variables, say, employment growth or employment and employment protection legislation. The problem is that these results do not correspond exactly with what the theory says, because new Keynesian analysis, which is argued, is that it is not it is the existence of an excessive employment protection what can have a negative impact on the labor market results. So in this sense, what they are arguing is that the relation should be non-linear instead of linear. And also, they are also arguing that it is the interaction between economic growth and the employment protection legislation what determines the impact of the employment protection legislation. In other words, they are arguing that the impact of employment protection can be different depending on the phase of the economic activity. So it can have a different impact depending, for instance, if we are in an expansion, during a boom, during an expansion, or if we are in a recession or during a crisis. And also, the last contribution of our analysis is that I think this is the very first study that we have found, at least published it, is that we are analyzing a very long period. We are analyzing a period that comprises 35 years. And this is important because most of the study uses a short period of time. And this has an implication in terms of the empirical methods that are used. Most, if not all, the studies that are analyzing the short period of time are based on, for instance, the use of methods like, especially when you will see a dynamic model, on GMM models. The problem is that GMM models are efficient only in the case only for short periods of time. In the case of we have a large panel with a large number of years. Other methods are more efficient than GMM. So we are, in this sense, that's what we lead us to use a dynamic fixed effect model that is more efficient in the case of large panels. So I apologize because we cannot see the first slide. We have the equation that we are following. Our baseline model is a model that tries to analyze a linear relationship between the explained variables and the explanatory variables. So as explained variables, our dependent variables, as I have said, we are using the employment growth rate, the employees growth rate, both measures in terms of the use of the first dependent on the use of labor force statistics and the national accounts to calculate the growth of this variable, and we are also analyzing the growth of unemployment rate. Our main explanatory variables are economic growth and the employment protection legislation. And regarding the economic growth, we are using the GDP and the gross fixed capital formation growth rates. And for the testing the impact of employment protection legislation, what we are using is the OECD indices. In this case, the EPRC, that measures the employment protection for permanent workers against individual and collective dismissals, and the EPT index that try to measure the employment protection for temporary and agency workers. And following the usual procedure, we are using another control variables that are related to the, for instance, demographic issues, that is the working age population growth rate, another variable related to the, for instance, the trade openness. And we are also testing to controlling for the existence of different labor institutions. Can be the rate of union density, the size of the active labor market policies, and we are also introducing as control variables that are related to the coordination and to the degree of centralization of the wage setting process, or the collective bargaining. The variable core and multi-level that I have obtained through the OECD AIS database. And we are also use a large, as mentioned, a large dynamic model with 35 years and 16 European countries. And we are used in this sense a problem that is very common in this kind of analysis is that there is a possible endogeneity of the variable of interest, in this case, employment protection legislation. And we have suffered some problems of the endogeneity for a number of reasons, mainly because, for instance, these indices may suffer measurement errors, that is, they cannot measure exactly, precisely, what is the true employment protection legislation. And there can also be, again, an inverse causal relationship between labor market outcomes and EPL indexes, because policymakers may decide, make a change, make reform the hiring and firing conditions indices based on the results of labor market performance. We must stress that we have tested the endogeneity of the two indices, and what is important is that we have found our findings is that the employment protection for temporary or permanent workers does not suffer this problem of endogeneity, but it is not the case of the employment protection for temporary workers, where we have detected an endogeneity problem that probably can be related to the fact that the use of the reforms trying to favor the use of temporary employment contract has been more intense, and the reform has been more intense than those reforms that have reduced the protection for permanent workers. And in this case, what we have found is that it is related to the and it's only a problem in the estimation of unemployment growth. So in this sense, what we, and this is something that could be reasonable, that as it is the potential explanation would be that countries have have tried to favor the use of temporary contracts when employment rates have been rising or are too high. So in this sense, what is important is that in this case, in the case of unemployment growth, we have estimated equation not only using OLS models, but also instrumental variables to take into account this problem of endogeneity. Very fast, because you will see the results are quite clear, and I will think that they don't require I don't know why. That some slides has disappeared. This is our main data, the summary data. It's important to notice, if you look at the figures of the left, that we can clearly detect the declining trend of the EPL indexes. According to the orthodox Inequality approach, this should lead into a higher growth of employment and employees, and to a strong decline in unemployment rates. However, you can see at the first figures, these results are not directly observed in the corresponding figures of the employment and unemployment growth. So this is a problem that can lead us to suspect that the reforms, this kind of reforms that have reduced employment protection, have not expected results. And this is something that our empirical results confirm. In this sense, as you will see, this is our first estimation that tried to estimate a linear relationship between the EPL and the growth of and the evolution of the variation of unemployment rates. Our results show that the employment protection does have no impact on the evolution of unemployment growth or of unemployment rates, and that only economic growth and the growth of working age population matters and explains what is the evolution, the changes registered in the figures of unemployment rates. Similar results are obtained when we analyze, for instance, the employment growth of rates. That in this case, again, we obtain the same result, that the employment protection legislation, any of the two indexes, have no significant impact on the evolution of employment. If we focus of employees, here we have a different picture. But it's a picture that cannot lead to conclude that EPL has a significant impact on the employees' growth rate. And the reason is that the results are not robust, because we obtain different results depending on if we are using national accounts data or we are using labor force statistics data. And again, for instance, it's also have the same problem, for instance, that we can detect in the case of the employment protection for temporary workers, that it's only significant when we are using as explanatory variables the investment growth. But this impact disappears when we are using GDP growth. So we cannot conclude that employment protection is a significant variable that determines the evolution of employment, employees, and unemployment rates in Europe. To test the robustness of our analysis, as we have explained before, we have also tested the existence of interaction effects between employment protection legislation and the existence of a non-linear relation, that is a non-linear impact of employment protection indexes and the evolution growth of employment and unemployment. And again, we can obtain the similar results. So these results of this robustness reinforces our view. Again, in the case of the unemployment, the determinants of the growth of unemployment rates, again, we are not able to detect a significant impact, a significant non-linear relation, or significant interaction effects with economic growth. A similar picture is similar results are obtained when we are analyzing the employment growth rates. We cannot we cannot find a nonlinear relationship between employment protection and employment growth. And in the case of when we try to test the existence of interaction effects, the problem is that we are not able to obtain a conclusive result, because the results change it with the variable used. That is GDP growth or GFGF, or it also depends on the sources of data. We are using the figures of employment coming from labor force statistics or the figures coming from national accounts. And again, a similar result is obtained in when we study the determinants of the evolution of the employees. So the results are the same. When we don't find a significant relationship, and when we find the results are not conclusive because they are affected by the sources of the data used in new analysis or the use of the GEF, of the investment growth, or the GDP growth. So to conclude, in 1 minute, the results of our study shows conclusively that contrary to new Keynesian economies, employment protection does not affect the dynamics of the that is the evolution of the unemployment rates, with economic growth being the main determinant of the variation in the unemployment rates. Therefore, we can conclude that labor market reforms that have tried to reduce employment or that have reduced employment protection for permanent and temporary workers have not contributed to reducing European unemployment rates. As regards the effects of unemployment, employment protection legislation does not affect total employment growth. And as regards employees, that is salary employment, it cannot be argued that the employment protection has a negative impact on employees' growth because the results are not robust, given that they depend on the variable used to measure the economic growth, to proxy the economic growth, or the source of the employment data. And similar results are obtained when we are analyzing nonlinear relationships and interaction effects. These results imply not only that the main determinant of labor market outcomes is economic growth, they also lead us to argue that we cannot judge the effectiveness, the impact of labor market, the economic, micro and macroeconomic impact of labor market reforms that have made the hiring and firing of workers more flexible, using or focusing only on the effects on employment and unemployment, because the results of our analysis show that they would have had no impact at all. Therefore, the evaluation of these reforms would be or should be determined by the existence of other direct and indirect effects on both the labor market and economic activity. As indicated in the text of our contribution, there is an existing growing literature that increasingly point out to the existence of negative micro and macroeconomic effects, so that we could assess these labor reforms in a negative way. So this is our presentation, and I think that we can. I can finish the presentation. As we mentioned before at the beginning of the session, once that the 3 papers have been presented, we will open a round of questions and comments from the audience. So to follow with the program, we will now move to the presentation of our second paper in the session, the paper presented by Professor José Luis Oreiro. We cannot listen to you, José Luis.
Sorry, turn off my microphone. Well, welcome and thanks, Jesus Ferreiro, to chair the section, and welcome to all participants of this workshop. So I will present my paper. Let me see if I can do it. Compartilhar slides. Okay, that's here. Well, oh no, that's the wrong. I mean, no, it's not this one. I have to. I make an error. Section C. Just to upload my slides. presupposed by. No. It's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay now. That's okay now. Well, the article is measuring the technological backwardness of the middle and low-income countries, the employment quality gap, and its relationship with per capita income gap. This is a paper written by me, by Stefan Wilson D'Amato, who is a PhD student of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Luciano Luiz Manarim D'Agostini, which is a professor of the Federal Institute of Paraná, and Paulo Sérgio de Oliveira Simões Gala, who is a professor of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation of São Paulo. Well, first of all, let's talk a little about the motivation of this article. Many developing countries are increasingly concentrated in activities that combine low added value per capita and low and or medium-low technological intensity due premature deindustrialization. That's, for instance, the case of Brazil. As I've told on the opening section of this workshop, in the questions that I made to Professor José Antonio Campo, Brazil, at the end of the 70s, the manufacturing output of Brazil was higher than the sum of the manufacturing output of India, China, and South Korea. But from the 80s on, we start a process of premature deindustrialization, and now we return to the same level of the manufacturing share that Brazil had in 1947. Yeah? And we also return to the pattern of specialization in international trade, in which Brazil is mainly primary goods exporter, where we export mainly soybeans, meat, and iron ore. And we have, up to now, we still have some high-tech manufacturing goods in our exports, for instance, planes produced by Embraer. But mainly our exports are now a return to the pattern of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where Brazil was basically a large, very large export of coffee. Okay, so this regression, Brazil and other Latin American economies had started a process of a negative regression of its structure of production. Well, this is the main reason for the so-called middle income trap of many developing countries, mainly in Latin America, according to the new developmentalist theory. The regressive structural change had profound impacts over the structure of employment in these countries that moves towards activities with lower technological intensity, widening the technological gap with developed economies. Now here I want to make a personal statement. I remember the first time that I visited Spain in 1985 with my parents. We returned to the village where my father born in Galicia. I had 14 years old, and even in large cities as La Coruña or Madrid, I could realize that the large cities, large Brazilian cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, still have more advanced services than in Madrid or at La Coruña. Well, 40 years after, the things completely have completely changed. So Brazil become a more primitive economy compared to the other countries than it was at the 80s. Okay, well, before a little discussion of history, economic history. Before the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate of countries' output rose slowly, during this period, differences in the living standards of people between different regions were comparatively small. After the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, it was noticed that some countries or regions of the world grew relatively faster, while other countries or regions remained stagnant, grew slowly, or even declined. In turn, it became evident that the living standards of people turned out to be different due to the accumulated growth rates of output per head over time. With respect to rich countries, which increased the share of manufacturing industry in total web output, the literature explains that people enjoy a relative better standard of living compared to low and middle income countries, which in general had some industrialization process and later, as in the case of Brazil and other Latin American economies, enter a path of premature industrialization or they're stuck in the production of primary goods based on natural resources. Here the references on the literature: Schumpeter, 1942, Rosenstein-Rodin, 1943, Verdun, 1949, Lewis, 1954, Prebisch, 1949, our great economist Celso Furtado, 1967, and Lord Nicholas Calder lectures that he delivered in the United States in 1967, Strategic Factors in Economic Development. These international differences in per capita income between countries can be explained by some variables. The share of employment in the industrial sector with respect to the total employment of the economy, the output per worker, the capital per worker, the education of the workforce in worker age, the participation of countries in international trade, political factors, institutional factors, among others. Well, given that, the main objective of our paper is to measure the quality of employment by technological intensity of the employment structure and to relate it with the difference in income between developing and developed economies. Our hypothesis is that the growing per capita income gap between developing and developed countries can be largely explained by differences in the quality of employment. I think that's the basic structuralist story about economic development. You know, as Professor José Antonio Campo said earlier on his lecture, economic development is, by definition, structural change. And structural change is the transfer of labor from low per capita value added activities to high per capita value activities. This is structural change, which means that if the income gap between countries is increasing over time and is a stylized fact, so this means that this should be reflected in the employment structure. It means that rich countries like Germany, like Norway, like Switzerland, or even the United States may have a larger share of its labor force employed in high-tech activities. So that's the idea. So that's the idea that led us in 2019 to develop the Index of Employment Quality. And based on the Index of Employment Quality, we construct another index, which is the Employment Quality Gap. So that's basically what we will do in this paper. We made some further developments of this idea that we published in 2019 in Portuguese. Now it's in English and will be published soon at PSL Quarter Review. So, a series of econometric tests were performed in order to achieve these goals. First, to assess the impact of the employment quality gap on the per capita income gap, also controlling the effect of the amount of capital per worker. And two, assess the impact of determinants of the employment quality gap, considering price and non-price effects. So, the methodology. First, the first step is to calculate a measure of the quality gap of the employment structure. The second step is to relate it to the per capita income gap between developed and middle and low income economies, controlling for other variables that could also explain the per capita income gap in order to isolate the effect of the employment quality gap over per capita income gap. And the third step, to evaluate the effects of price and non-price competitiveness factors over the employment quality gap in order to determine the importance of real exchange rate over the employment gap and hence over per capita income gap. I think that many of you know that one of the basic propositions of the new developmentalist theory is that in countries that are rich in natural resources like Brazil or Argentina or Chile or Uruguay and so on and so forth, there is a long-run trend for overvaluation of real exchange rate. This overvaluation of real exchange rate favors the activities of primary goods production, but harms the the manufacturing industry. So this must have some effect over the structure of employment. So in order to do these three steps, we adopt the following methodology. First of all, we disaggregate the manufacturing industry into several subsectors by technological intensity. Here we use three main categories: low tech sectors, medium tech sectors, and high tech sectors, following the classification described in the paper of Treghina and Andreoni, published in 2020, the table 1 of that paper. Second, we built the employment quality index by each country on the sample, by each period. The employment quality index is defined by the ratio between the sum of the share of the workforce in the high technological intensity sectors and the sum of the labor force share in the low and medium technological intensity sectors, according to equation 1 below. So that's a very intuitive index of quality of employment. You know, the quality of employment will be higher. Higher will be the share of the labor force employed in the high-tech services. Okay, so second, we build the employment quality gap by country and by period. The employment quality gap is defined as the ratio of the employment quality gap of the country considered as the benchmark, and in this paper we still use the United States as the benchmark. The same methodology is used by Fagerberg on his paper of 1988, so far as I know, was published on Journal of Economic Literature, and he used precisely the United States as the benchmark for calculating the technological gap. So he created this concept of technological gap, which is similar to our concept of employment quality gap. So the employment quality gap is defined as the ratio of the employment quality index of the United States with respect to the other countries on the sample that has low or middle income. Then we estimate the per capita income gap and employment quality gap as a function of the conditional convergence of per capita income, the employment quality gaps, the capital stock per capita according to the following linear stochastic model. So you can see the equation, it will be the equation 3 of the paper. And then we estimated employment quality gap as a function of the human capital index, of the economic complexity index. The economic complexity index is the one developed by Hidalgo and Hausmann, and it can be known on the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and the bilateral real exchange rate, according to equation 4. Well, here we have the Pedro data estimation for the period between 2001 and 2014, and the coefficients. As we can see, we have two specifications for fixed effects of GMM for the Pedro data, and we also made two estimates for GMM system. Well, the employment quality gap has, as expected, a positive and statistically significant effect over the per capita income gap. Of course, that is not only the only reason or the only factor that explains the per capita income gap. The capital stock per worker has a higher effect over the per capita income gap, but I think it's important to realize that these results shows the validity of a node structuralist idea. The idea is that what the country produce matter. So it's completely different from the neoclassical growth models, for solo or even new growth models, where what matters for long-run growth is capital factor accumulation. You have to increase your capital per worker, and have to increase technological knowledge, which is the Solo's residual, or in more recent developments of the neoclassical theory, you can increase your or reduce your gap of income per capita relative to United States if you reduce the misallocation of factors of production. So this is the traditional orthodox idea. The structuralist idea is that, okay, of course, that accumulation of capital is important for economic development, but is also necessary to accumulate capital on the right sectors, the sectors that have increasing returns, which means manufacturing sectors and high-tech services. So this data is precisely showing to us that the structure of production and employment matters for long-run development, which means that countries that have a low quality of employment will be a further reason to have a higher per capita income gap compared with countries that have a higher employment quality gap. Okay, the next step was to regress the employment quality gap for the same period, 2001-2014, with three variables. Two of them are representing non-price competitiveness of exports, which is human capital and economic complexity index, and the bilateral exchange rate, real exchange rate, right? So the the data shows to us that both factors, non-price competitiveness, represented by human capital and economic complexity index, and bilateral re-exchange rate, have effects over employment quality gap. This means that to increase the employment quality gap and thereby to reduce the per capita income gap, the country, middle and low income countries, have to invest in the accumulation of human capital, in the sophistication of its productive structure, but also have to maintain a competitive real exchange rate. Well, the results endorse the arguments presented in the literature, according to which the quality of employment, the capital stock per worker, and together industrial policies are fundamental to reduce the income gap between developing economies compared with the benchmark economy, which we consider to be the United States. It can be said that the productive structure of countries that concentrate activities with low value added per capita and low and medium low technological intensity are factors that explain the growing delay of catching up for low and medium income per capita economies relative to developed countries. Since developing economies are more labor intensive and increasing labor productivity helps to reduce the per capita income gaps, policies that encourage the growth of human capital in these economies will allow for a reduction in income inequality between the development and developed economies. So here are the photos of the authors of this article. And thank you. Obrigado, gracias, je vous remercie. Well, the rest I don't know how to pronounce. Many thanks. I finished my presentation.
Very much, José Luis, for such an interesting and relevant presentation. I don't know if we have a third paper in the session, paper by Pedro Micussi, but I don't know if there is, if Pedro is now connected, because he also explained us that he would have some problems.
Yes, he told me by WhatsApp that he was entering. Yes, Pedro is entering.
Here it is. Okay, Pedro, thank you very much. Welcome to the session. As I have explained at the beginning of the session, we have planned to present the three papers in a row, more or less 20-25 minutes, so we can have enough room, let's say around 15, 20, 25 minutes from questions and comments from the audience that are following the session and the YouTube channel, and also for the comments that any of us may have about the others papers. So when you want, you can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ferreiro. Thank you, Professor Oreiro.
And sorry, and Pedro, and before starting the presentation, yes, I remember to all the people that are following the session on the YouTube channel that you can make your questions, writing it at the chat at the YouTube, and we will be able to read it and to move it to translate it to the corresponding presenter. Thank you.
Okay.
What you want, Pedro?
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say I'm sorry I was not able to join the room at the beginning of the session. I was in another meeting, but here I am. I'd like to thank you again, Professor Ferreiro and Oreiro, for the opportunity. I'm Pedro Micussi. I hold a master's degree in sociology from the University of São Paulo, and I am very interested in political economy aspects and economic sociology. So here, although I'm also an economist now, I will try to present a research that is mostly based in sociological methodology. So I'll try to discuss some political economy aspects, but the presentation, the research was made based in sociological approach and methodology but I think it will be able to discuss some interesting things after it. So the name of my presentation is The Political Economy of Economic Policy, Industrial Entrepreneurs and Macroeconomic Prices in Brazil between 2003 and 2016. So the idea here is to present an discussion on how the macroeconomic prices are disputed between different social classes. So I will try to present it and to discuss it based in a research made among IEG. IEG is a Brazilian think tank that, in my view, aggregate the most important industrial entrepreneurs in Brazil. So they are represented in IEG, the big industrials in Brazil, the big industrialists in Brazil. So the idea is, with using this research, try to discuss some bigger things of the macroeconomic policy in Brazil. So just 1 second here. First of all, we'll present IERI. That was the main object of my research. Then I will try to present the dispute for what the industrialists of IERI call the competitive exchange rate and the interest rate. And in this dispute made by the IED's executives, I will try to show how they difference they from the financial sector. So in this dispute and in this defense for competitive exchange rates and interest rates, how these industrialists try put themselves in confrontation with the financial sector. Then I will try to present the dispute of IEG around the profit and the wage rate. And in this dispute, I will try to present how they, in this time, those industrialists put themselves in confrontation with the workers. After it, I will try to present some ideas and to try to understand if it's possible, and these are our questions to the debate, if it's possible to understand IED as a new developmentalist think tank, and if it's possible to see some new developmentalist I don't know, characteristics in the thought of those industrial entrepreneurs. And finally, I will try to discuss, after my presentations, the possibilities of developmentalist class coalitions in contemporary Brazil. So this was what I said. The objective here is try to discuss some of the disputes among the macroeconomic policy. So I will not try to discuss and to analyze the macroeconomic policy itself, but the disputes behind the design of macroeconomic policy Brazil during 2003-2016, that, as you know, is the period of the Workers' Party government in Brazil. So the presentation is based on economic sociological case studies, and the idea here is that it's possible to identify a dispute between different social classes around 4 or 5 macroeconomic prices between 2003 and 2016. So the profit rate, the interest rate, the exchange rate, and the wage rate. It is possible to see, in my view, a dispute between social classes for around it. So this is the methodology. I try to analyze more than 800 interviews and articles written by the IERI's executives, published in the press between 2003 and 2016. And I also made interviews with some of the most important businessmen gathered in the think tank. So IED, for those who don't know, it's an institution founded in 1989 by a group of major Brazilian capitalists. They saw in that time that Brazil has arrived in a scenario of exhaustion and crisis of the developmentalist cycle, and then try to advocate for a national development strategy in which Brazil would able to integrate in the world economy and um, to be able to continue its industrialization process, but uh, not going back to old paradigms like the import substitution strategy and so on. So the idea of those businessmen was to promote a strategy based in this concept, like it's called competitive integration. So the idea is to integrate the Brazilian economy in the international economy to foster the industry. So here it's a table with some of the presidents of IED between 2003 and 2016. It's in Portuguese, but you can see here some of the most important manufacturing business economics. It's important to say that all the businessmen in IED are from Brazilian company and from manufacturing Brazilian companies. So there is this kind of development. I don't know how can I say it, but motivation to the creation of the think tank. So, okay, let's go to the most important here. It's the dispute for competitive exchange rates and interest rates. I'm sorry. So I think it's possible to see that those businessmen shows constant dissatisfaction with the interest rate and exchange rate in Brazil, and they advocate for more competitive rates for the industry. And in this dispute, they put themselves in confrontation with the demands and the interests of the financial sector. So here, I will try to show some declarations of those businessmen to base my point of view. So Ivonshi Yoship, that was a former IED businessman, she said, the interference in the exchange rate is not a right, but an obligation of the state. If you don't interfere, the authority is failing. In the same way that the components to interfere in the interest rates, the central bank also has an obligation to reduce the country's external dependence. This policy is as serious as the one to fight inflation. Pedro von Chavsky, that was as well president of IED, in an interview said, I remember we used to say in the period of the Workers' Party, that was the difference between heaven and hell. The banker's paradise was low exchange rates and high interest rate, and the industrialist paradise was the opposite, high exchange rates and low interest rate. So we live for too long with interest rates that are definitely too high, and in my view, unnecessary from a macroeconomic point of view. So I think this declarations, it's important to see how those industrialists put themselves in confrontation with the financial sector. There is some debate in the literature that about the financialization of the industry and the actors, but I think in my research it's possible to see that those actions, at least in they speak, they put themselves, and maybe in the action as well, in confrontation with the financial sector. So Ivo Rosset, that is also an industrialist of IED, said in an interview that the interest rate was absurd. It was disproportionate. It was a very difficult period, and there's no need for interest rate to be so high. Here again, he made a discussion on what he thought it was better to control inflation in Brazil and so on. But again, I think it's possible to see how they put themselves against the high interest rate in Brazil and the exchange rate as well. Here it's a declaration made by Johnny Staub. He's a very important and iconic entrepreneur because he was one of the first entrepreneurs to support Lula campaign. But in an interview in 2020, he said both Fernando Henrique government and the Lula government and Dilma government greatly harmed the industry in Brazil, mainly because of the exchange rate policy with the overvalued real that started with Gustavo Franco in 1944. This was deadly. Brazilian industry was certainly better than Korea and China, and we were sure that Brazil would be an industrial economic power. But this has unbalanced the sector. Okay, the exchange rate issue, the industry downturn, and the technological issue that we are not able to follow for various reasons unbalanced the sector. So I think that is very, I don't know, it's significant to show Eugenio Staub, that was one of the first entrepreneurs to support Lula, to make this declaration saying, okay, but after all, Lula and Dilma made a macroeconomic policy that was very similar to Fernando Henrique. So here I try to present something that for you it's very well known, but the difference between the exchange rate in Brazil and what would be for the industry. So I think that those industrialists had a point, or had something to support again. But okay, so this is the first part, and I think in this case it's possible to see how those industrialists put themselves in dispute within or with or against the financial sector of the economy. The second part of my presentation, I try to present how those industrialists put themselves in confrontation with the workers in Brazil, because it's possible to see mainly from 2010 that they started to show I don't know, they start to say that the wage rate was, or the salaries was too high in Brazil, and then put themselves in action to try to go to put the wage rate and the salaries in a lower level. So here it's a declaration from Pedro Passos in 2014. Pedro Passos, it's from Natura, and was also president of IED, and he said, any measure that makes wage rise above productivity, although this was not the only thing that put pressure on wages, or any rule that index price in the economy, needs to be seen very carefully. I think that at some point this would need to be reviewed. We have a problem with the cost of labor that rise above productivity growth, but more than that, we have a very serious problem, which is a framework of labor laws that create disputes in companies. Little flexibility for productions that today has more outsourced companies and other partners. And Brazilian law is still regulates lunchtime, things that should no longer exist. And so this declaration from 2014, but it's possible to see declarations from 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. Here there is another declaration. It's an article written by IED and Fiesp in the Valor Econômico newspaper, the most important economic newspaper in Brazil. This is very significant as well, because IED was created in 1989 with a view that the traditional representation of of the industry was not more able to represent the interests of the big companies in Brazil. And Fiesp, as you know, it's a very traditional association in Brazil. So the fact that the both associations write an article together, it's not something that we cannot underline. So the article was about the growth of salary above productivity, and they say the growth of wages above labor of productivity would be one of the factors that explain the weak performances of the industrial sector. In short, the evidence is very strong in the sense of the detachment between labor productivity and wages paid in the industry. Together with other factors, this resulted in the lethargy of the manufacturing industry, dragging with investment and economic activity in the country as a whole. So if it's possible to see this movement of those agents to put the salaries down, it's also possible to see in the same period. That's something that the sociology of work showed very well, that in this period we have a boom in strikes in Brazil. So here we can see the series, and you can say that from 2010 2011 there's a very high a boom in the strikes in Brazil. So I think it's possible to see that those industrialists was seeing an increase in the striker movement in Brazil, and saw at the same time, and this is something that the research group as well has discussed in a very, very interesting webinar that I follow about the profit rate in Brazil, is we can see as well a decline in the profit rate in Brazil from the exact same period, from 2010. We can see here it's is a graph made by Eduardo Pinto that analyzed the 500 largest Brazilian non-financier companies. But if you look to other graphs, and here's a study made by Martins and Ruzitsky that made from the national count that shows that the same thing. We have a going down of the profit rate, profit squeeze, and here another graph that say more or less the same thing. A study made on the 200 largest Brazilian companies. My idea is, okay, we have all a discussion here if it's possible to correlate and identify a relation between the strikes in Brazil and the profit squeeze. But I think that the industrial businessmen saw this way. So they are seeing a profit squeeze at the same time they saw a strike boom. So it's possible to see that they saw that the strikers and the stranded of the labor movement in Brazil was one of the responsibles of the profit squeeze seen in the period. Here, it's other table that show the profit squeeze. This is a study made by Yegi, and we can see that from 2010, it's possible to see the margins going down and so on. I don't know if I have so much time. I think I will. I have 25 minutes. Is that correct, or 20 minutes? I'm sorry. Okay, 25. So I try to present some here another discussion. If it is it possible to understand the Yeti and the industrial entrepreneurs of Yeti, some characteristic of the new developmentalists, and with this discussion, I'd like to underline how those agents underline as well the macroeconomic policy and how they see macroeconomic policy in a way that is more important than industrial policy. Here again, a declaration made by Eugenio Staub that said, here like we missed the technological and economic trends, etc., and he said, because today I have doubts because the industrial policies of Luciano Coutinho and the PT did not work either. So for many years, the IERI advocated in favor of industrial policies for and incentives and so on. But he said, today I have doubts if this is the way. I think the path is more macroeconomic policies compatible with industrialization and technological policy. Here again, the Danielship made a declaration in the same sense. I have a view that industrial policy alone is not the predominant factor. I tend to think that it will be more or less useful if it has subsidiary to a broader or recent agenda that starts with driving the country's macroeconomic trajectory. And an Iradi entrepreneur that did not want to be identified also made a declaration in the same sense. He said here, I would say the following. I have been reasoned and today I don't have a conviction, but I don't need an industrial policy. He said, I don't think I need an industrial policy. I need a country policy. That's interesting, isn't it? I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I don't want any industrial privilege, zero. But I want the rest of things working right, logistic working now, electricity, etc., etc. So I'd like to present those ideas and to put in the debate if it's possible to see some new developmentalist characteristics in the thought of those agents. Here again, Pedro Passo said in my approach, these industrial policies was a lot of sectoral industrial policy, and so he's also pointing that in his view it would be more productivity to have a macroeconomic policy than industrial policies or sectoral or vertical policies. So my closing remarks is I would like to discuss again to put in discussion the possibilities and limits of class coalitions and developmentalist class coalitions in Brazil, because first of all, I think in a debate, okay, I say there is a difference between the industrial entrepreneurs and the financial sector. I think it's possible to see that those industrial put themselves in confrontation with the demands and the interests of the financial sector. So I think this is a positive point. It's possible to see industrial entrepreneurs that advocate for industrial national development strategy. This is a point because there is a debate to people that say that no, we do not have those agents in Brazil. There is a financialization of the industry in Brazil, and these actors do not exist anymore. And I think the contrary. No, there is this action on those actions. But in the other hand, I think what we saw from 2010 and the dispute among the profit rate and the wage rate, the salaries rate, put some questions on the possibilities of a class coalitions that put together industrial entrepreneurs and workers to foster the industrialization in Brazil, because in a moment of profit squeeze and when the profits go down, the industrial put themselves in direct confrontation with the workers and maybe in a coalition with the financial sector against the workers. And I think what we saw in Brazil in 2016 with the impeachment of Dilma and then with the labor reform and the Agenda para o Futuro maybe put some doubts in this possibility. So this is it. I would like to thank you again, and I hope it was possible to I made me clear.
So now we can open the round for comments and questions from the floor. At this time, I think that there is no question at the chat of the YouTube channel. So if in this sense, if any of the presenters wants to make any comments or question to any of the other paper presented in the session.
Yes, I want to do two questions, one for you, Jesus, and another for Pedro. Well, Jesus, you analyzed in your paper the impact of labor protection legislation over unemployment growth rates, unemployment rates, and you find there is no statistical significance on this relation. So basically, you say that the employment legislation does not matter for reducing unemployment. The only policy that can reduce unemployment is to increase economic growth. I agree with that. But when we look at to the different European countries, the fact is that the long-term average unemployment rate between European countries are very different. For instance, the unemployment rate in Spain is twice or 3 times larger than the unemployment rate in France and Germany. But if you look to the Spanish growth rate since the middle of the 90s, Spain had grown at much faster than France and Germany. And but it remained with an unemployment rate of almost 2 digits until the beginning of the financial recession of 2008. So why? My question is, what explains these large differences in unemployment rates between European countries, and more important, between European countries that belongs to the euro area? You know, I think that is one question. Well, about for Pedro, yes, I agree with the line of your line of research. What surprised me in recent years is that the apparently the industrial entrepreneurs are supporting this this agenda of reforms that basically will do nothing to increase the competitiveness of Brazilian manufacturing industry. For instance, when we talk about electrical power, since Temer's government, the price of electrical power increased a lot. The interest rates, the basic interest rate, except on the brief period of 2020, due to the pandemic of COVID-19, the interest rates remain higher. Even more problematic when you look to the spread of the banking sector. The Brazilian bank spreads are the highest in the entire world, which is absolutely insane. For a company to borrow money for a commercial bank, it will pay minimum at 50% per year, with absolute, in real terms, it means more than 40% per year of interest rate. No business, no legal business in the world can have a rate of return over equity that's larger than 15%. So if you have to pay, if the cost of capital cost of capital in Brazil, which includes not only the basic interest rate, the short-term interest rate, but the interest rate for others' capital, is 40%. Basically, the investment in manufacturing industry is impossible. But they are satisfied with the last governments. Maybe the thing that you do present about strikes. I remember that Michael Kalexki says that the full employment was not a good policy for industrialists, because when you have full employment, unions want demands higher wages and so on and so forth. But it's my first question. Why those entrepreneurs are supporting policies that simply do not help the manufacturing industry, including this government? The Ministry of Industry was extinguished. So for me, my personal explanation is that the financialization of the Brazilian economy had achieved also the industrial sector, and so they compensate the lack of earnings of manufacturing activities with financial gains. That's my two questions.
Thank you very much, José Luis. I don't know if you have been able to listen the two previous presentation, Pedro. In this case, if you have some question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was not able to join the room at the time.
Okay, so if perhaps if we can make, I would like to make some questions, but perhaps before making my question, I think that perhaps it's better that you and me, Pedro, answer the questions presented by José Luis. So if you want, you can start.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah, so Oreiro, I think that the support of those agents for Bolsonaro and Temer, we can understand as long as the two governments made reforms for capital against labor, maybe we can understand the support of those agents with this agenda to put labor in its place and to slow down the strikes.
Marx is alive.
Because
I'm becoming a Marxist after 50 years old. In general, people are Marxists when they enter the faculty with 20 years old. But when I entered in the faculty with 18 years old, I was a Keynesian conservative economist. I defend capitalism, of course, and the social democratic version of capitalism. I read Marx, and the Communist Manifesto, but just to deny, no, we don't want a Soviet style government, so on and so forth. But those people are making me to believe that Marx was right.
Yeah, and maybe this is a point, because in my, I will say, in my research, I was concerned about how the industrialists saw the macroeconomic policy, industrial policy in Brazil between 2003 and 2016. And during my research, I start to saw those industrialists complain about the wages and the salary from 2010 and so on. So it was not in my map, in my first map, to try to analyze how those agents was concerned about salary and wages, but at some time this started to point out. So in my view, this is important. It was not something that was concerned in the first moment, but I think this is really important. I think maybe in this dispute, I was saying about the dispute of those industrialists for against the financial sector, and after against the workers, maybe against the workers it's a more important dispute for those agents. And if they have to choose, they they afterwards choose to be with the financial sector against the workers, and I think Bolsonaro and Temer made a reform agenda that was very interested for they in those terms. And regarding financialization, this is a question for me as well, because I don't know if you analyze the balance of companies, and we can say a financialization of the companies, but at the same time they saw and they express, at least between 2003 and 2016, this discourse against the financial sector and against the high interest rates and so on. So I think maybe, I don't know, we would need to make more research between 2016 and 2022 to see if they are also complaining about the interest rate and so on, or if with all this agenda of labor reforms and the integration of the Brazilian economy with the international economy is sufficient today. Because I also think that there is a difference between the median and little companies with the large companies, and IED gathered the big economies, the big companies in Brazil, and maybe for those companies it's very important to integrate the Brazilian economy in the international economy, and to put Brazil in the global value chains, etc., etc. And if Bolsonaro and Temer are able to integrate Brazil with the international economy, they are okay with it, and they support the agenda.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Well, and regarding your question, José Luis, this is a relevant question. That is, when we analyze, for instance, which are the reasons behind the difference in the unemployment rates, because what we are actually testing is what the new Keynesian economy says. That is, the employment protection legislation, what is affecting is to the evolution of the, for instance, of unemployment rates and growth. But there is a huge gap where we don't know what are the main determinants of the levels of unemployment rates. In this sense, for instance, we must notice that, for instance, that we don't have data about employment protection, and we don't have data about the labor market institution before in many countries, before the mid-80s or before the 90s. So we don't know what happened in the late 70s and 80s when the unemployment rates boomed in many countries. What is important is, well, when we have some kind of data, we don't see a direct relation between the difference in some labor institutions, for instance, employment protection, and the evolution and the increase in the unemployment rates in this period. Actually, the employment protection in Europe was quite similar. And in many countries, there was no labor market reform in this period. But in this period was when unemployment rates boom in Europe. So there is something behind this behavior that is not related to labor market institutions. And I think that in this case, it has to do with some structural changes that occur in the countries. So in some cases, they are related to demographic factors, but also with the restructuring, a change in this productive structure. In some cases, that it was, for instance, the case of Spain. And don't forget that the potential impact that have, and now it's been accepted, that the implementation of restrictive policy, mainly anti-inflationary policies, have had on the economic activity in the long term, and also through the hysteresis effect on the long-term unemployment rates. And when we have data, what we can see in this case is that perhaps the relationship will be inverse. It says that when we have, when I have told you, if we look at the total figures of employment employees, there is no effect. this does not imply that they not has effect in terms of the composition of employment, because what we detect is, for instance, is a rise in the share of temporary workers, part-time workers, agency workers, and a decline in the permanent workers. So, for instance, in cases like Spain, where they have been implemented such intense labor reforms, and in other countries, what we are detecting is that the labor market and the employment is not that stable relationship that usually explained in the introductory textbooks. But on the contrary, employment has a strong cyclical component. For instance, the case of Spain, where in booms we create a lot of unemployment and the unemployment rate declines, but in recessions there is also a huge destruction of employment and a huge increase in unemployment rates. And in some cases, the hysteresis effects, it moves also not only, it moves from the evolution of the unemployment rate in the short run to what could be the size of unemployment rates in the long term. I mean, the cyclical unemployment is also converted in a structural unemployment. This can be an interpretation, or the reason that precisely opposite to what was expected, an excessive labor market flexibility can be a factor that explains, in this case, the high levels of unemployment in some European countries. And well, besides this explanation, I would also like to make some comments or questions to both of you. In this is starting with Pedro. The debate that you are explaining that is taking place in Brazil is quite similar to the debate that we have in some years ago, some decades ago, in Spain and in Europe. Actually, I was remember one statement of the former of the first Ministry of Industry in the first socialist government, that is, I'm talking of the 82, 83, Carlos Olchaga, who was the Ministry of Industry, and it's, well, among other reasons, remember, but his famous statement that the best industrial policy is the one that does not exist. Usually 40 decades ago, with the economic crisis, with the consequence of the economic crisis from the Great Recession and the COVID, we are now moving to precisely an opposite side, where we are trying to promote, for instance, with the structural policies from the European Union, is trying to strengthen the industrial sector in Europe, because it's supposed that this is the basis of the competitiveness in also the welfare and economic activity in the long run. So we are trying to do opposite. Now this debate that in 2 or 3 decades ago was in favor of the financial sector, now it has changed, and now it's favoring the industrial entrepreneurs. But what it seems is that when you, and I don't know if that's something that I would like to confirm, is that when you were, I don't know, you hear me? Okay.
Technology.
Yeah. Now? Can you hear me now, Pedro? Can you hear me?
Pedro, are you listening? In the chat that he told that I have lost your sound.
Yeah, I don't know.
Make the comments to me, and then
yeah. And my comment was that when you have that you comment the reason that the structure of productive is a key explanatory variable of development. Recently, I was thinking of the relationship between labor market flexibility and structural change, because I don't know if this may have happened in Brazil, but in Europe, not only in Spain but in other countries, what we have, some studies have detected precisely is that those labor market reforms that have tried to promote to increase the labor flexibility has had a negative impact on, for instance, some supply side elements like the productivity growth, capital accumulation, innovation activities. So in this sense, and we have detected it, for instance, in Spain and other countries, that an excessive labor flexibility has promoted the activity of precisely the low value added sectors. So it is it's contributing to create a model of competitiveness and a model of productive structure based precisely on those sectors that have the poorest, the smallest positive impact on the economic growth. So I don't know, in this sense, some part of this negative structural change that you have suffered in Brazil may have, in part or in total, to a large extent, been affected by the changes, institutional changes in the Brazilian labor market.
Well, I think that there is a relation between institutional change in the labor market and the structural change. But my view is that the causality relation is just the other way around. You know, because of premature industrialization and because we have transfer labor to low added value per worker, then we have to change the institutions or labor market institutions that was created in the 30s and 40s by Getúlio Vargas' government, which are basically a fascist government. But he created the labor laws, the so-called CLT, consolidation of the laws of labor, that was thought to be labor legislation for an industrial and urban society, you know. But due to the premature industrialization, the employment relations became more fragile, and they have to adapt the institutions of the labor market to the reality of the productive structure, you know, which now is based on low tax services. And the reality of our labor market is more or less half of the labor force worked as informal employees and self-employed. So this information, I do not know any country in the world that has half of the labor force informal, working in the informal sector or self-employed. So my understanding is that the regressive structural change demands regressive institutional change in case of labor relations. So that's the basic reason for the labor form of 2017. So basically, Brazilian entrepreneurs are adapting to a more primitive production structure, and this means that we have to revert to a more primitive labor relations.
Okay. I don't know if Pedro is now listening to us.
Well, he said that he's back. Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, and yes, because I think that we must finish. What I wanted, that was the comment that I want to tell you is that when you look at your explanation of the dispute between the wage and profits, it seems that in all the statements, in all the discourses, when you look at the relations between wages and productivity, they are considered as fully independent variables, as if there were no relation between the evolution of wages and the evolution of growth. As if they did not consider, for instance, that the growth of productivity may affect the evolution of wages, and also that the evolution of wages can affect productivity. Because as we were talking previously with José, this, for instance, is one of the problems of Spain. We have been favored, in this sense, say, some institutional labor market reforms trying to promote a control or even a decline in real wages as a strategy to rise our competitiveness. But the problem is that 2 or 3 decades after this strategy began, what we have detected is that we have had a problem because our productivity is quite low. And one idea that many of us have in mind is that precisely these pressures to contain or to reduce real wages have had a negative impact in the long term in terms of the productivity growth. So I think that they are not considering the difference between the short-term impact of any policy trying to moderate wage growth and the long-term impact of these kind of policies.
Yeah, no, probably. And but yeah, I think what maybe is the case that they see in the short term profit squeeze and a boom in strikes, the labor movement get stronger, and they say, oh my God, what's happening? And at the same time, the economy was going down, and they say, oh, what we can do in this situation? Maybe the fault it's the salaries and the wages, and we will go to put our efforts to put down the salaries and the wages. But yeah, of course, I think there is long term patterns that they do not consider in the daily action.
Okay, I don't know if there is any other comment or question.
Just one comment to Pedro. As some years ago, I've met an industrial entrepreneur of the state of Goiás. I will not tell the name here, but after I told it to you by WhatsApp, right? But he financed research that was designed for monetary reform in Brazil. The idea is to make the complete de-indexation of the Brazilian economy in order for have a low inflation rate and low interest rates. So unfortunately, we made the research. We also, me and Professor Getúlio Fernando Costa Santos of Federal University of Uberlândia, we published the result of the part of the result of the research in a book edited by Luis Fernando de Paula and Fernando Ferrari Filho. I believe that is in Routledge, maybe not this year, but we made some very interesting proposals about the indexation of the Brazilian economy in order for have a low inflation with a low level of inflation inertia. This could allow the central bank to fix short-term interest rates at lower levels, and this will be in the best interest of industry. But the fact is that nobody listened. Nobody listened. It's amazing. They are worried about the labor reforms, the reform of the public sector, that they will not benefit with this in any situation. So that's the only comment. But after we can talk in private about this Brazilian, this entrepreneur of the state of Goiás.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's now time to finish this really interesting session. We are going to start in a few minutes with the specialization on cultural heritage and regional development, that will be followed by the specialization of the Agence Française de Développement. So I invite you, to all of you, the people that have participated as presenters in the session, and to all the rest of people that has been able to follow us through the YouTube channel, to continue and to remain at the workshop, attending these new special sessions. So thank you very much to all of you, and we can be in contact. Okay, bye.
Okay.
See you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Professor.
very much.
Bye-bye. See you.